I'm Jessie, and I'm from the University of Colorado Boulder, and more recently from Spotify, and I'm presenting this work today on behalf of my colleagues and co-authors, Michael Madaio, who's in the room, and Robin Burke and Casey Fiesler. So here's an overview of where I'm going to take us today, and I'm going to begin with the motivation for this work. So many of us are probably aware, this is fact, that in recent years, fairness in machine learning has become a growing concern. And this is especially true in domains like recommendation, where algorithms shape who gets visibility, who gets attention, and who gets opportunities. Now, recommender systems also involve stakeholders that have competing needs, like end users and item or content providers, and they might have conflicting fairness concerns. This makes recommendation a uniquely challenging context for fairness work. To address fairness concerns, research communities such as FACT have developed a wide range of metrics and methods and tools to evaluate fairness, but these are often designed under idealized or controlled conditions, and when it comes to applying them in real-world industry settings, the translation is rarely smooth. And a lot of prior research has shown that theoretical frameworks do not always account for the complex organizational, technical, and political realities of industry teams. Now, this is in part because industry practitioners face numerous constraints that shape how and whether they can do fairness work at all. They're often navigating limited time and resources, constantly evolving product teams, and a lack of decision-making power. And on top of all this, practitioners often lack institutional support to prioritize ethics work in the first place. These realities create deep tensions between what is ideal and what's actually possible. This tension has sparked debate in our own research community at FACT about whether fairness work ought to focus on ideal solutions that seek to dismantle flawed systems entirely, or whether we ought to try to improve flawed systems as best as we can, even if those solutions aren't necessarily ideal. And I will note that neither of these approaches is right or wrong. Each approach has its own costs and benefits that we discuss at length in the paper. In this work, though, we took the pragmatic stance, the idea that imperfect fairness evaluations are still meaningful, especially when perfect solutions are out of reach. So specifically, we focused on two research questions. We wanted to know what constraints arise in machine learning fairness evaluations within industry, and how do they influence decision-making for practitioners. And also, we wanted to know how do experts think that fairness evaluations can be improved within the practical constraints of industry. So I'll briefly describe our methods. We conducted 21 interviews with machine learning fairness experts, most of whom had experience with recommender systems, since that was our case study for this work. And we recruited them through a combination of convenience and snowball sampling. We ended up with 10 academics and 11 industry practitioners who had an average of about 6.5 years of experience with machine learning fairness and an average of close to 9 years of experience with recommender systems. During interviews, we discussed their current practices for evaluating fairness and how they thought that those practices could and should be improved. So now I will turn to our results. We identified 3 main constraints that impacted decision-making for conducting fairness evaluation in industry contexts. I'm going to go through each of these one by one and describe how the participants in our study worked within these constraints to still conduct a meaningful fairness evaluation. So the first constraint was balancing competing interests, such as the interests of various teams within an organization. So participant 13 described that if you don't own the model, there's not much you can do to evaluate fairness without having the support of the modeling team. The challenge here is that modeling teams have very different incentives than responsible AI and fairness evaluation teams. Modeling teams are incentivized to move and innovate and push products quickly, while fairness evaluation teams benefit from slowing things down and doing their due diligence to make sure that there's not unintentional harm being caused. And one way that participants in our study described working within this constraint was to optimize fairness with respect to a business baseline to appease the needs of the modeling teams. So an example of this was brought up by participant 10, who said they maximize fairness subject to the constraint of not dropping performance more than X%. So they think of the business performance metrics as the constraint, rather than thinking of a fairness threshold as the goal. The next constraint brought up by participants was lacking power or access to certain supports like demographic data and impacted stakeholders. This is not a new finding. Previous research has also shown this. And one well-known workaround is to conduct internal red teaming to make fake or mock accounts of users who they think might be unfairly treated by their platform to see what fairness concerns arise in the event that they don't have access to users to conduct user studies. The third constraint brought up by participants was the need to get buy-in from leadership to actually conduct fairness evaluations in the first place. And one participant mentioned that they work within this constraint by tying their work to the bottom line, maybe by framing their fairness evaluation as something that helps with PR concerns or is a compliance requirement. So all of this working within these business-minded constraints led the participants in our study to do what's called satisficing. This is a combination of the words satisfy and suffice. It was coined by Herbert Simon. It's a decision-making strategy that seeks a satisfactory or adequate outcome rather than an optimal one. And so this pathway between these business-minded constraints to this act of satisficing is what we have named in this work pragmatic fairness. And pragmatic fairness is really all about being okay with imperfection and striving for a satisfactory approach to fairness evaluation rather than an ideal approach, while recognizing that the ideal approach is just not always possible in the real world, as unfortunate as that may be. So now on to the second research question: how do experts think that fairness evaluations can be improved within the practical constraints of industry? Really, this question just came down to how can we improve pragmatic fairness? We provide many examples from participants in the paper. I'm going to briefly go over 3 today. So one example to improve pragmatic fairness is to include users more meaningfully in fairness evaluations. I will note that it's not always possible to include users in evaluations. I just said that a few minutes ago, but in the event that you do have access to users to conduct user studies, some participants mentioned it's really important to educate them about the technical details of a system, so they're not just giving high-level feedback, but it's actually meaningful and usable, but to not overwhelm them with those details so that they shut down and they can't actually contribute in a valuable way. The second idea brought up by participants was to be better about evaluating construct validity. This is basically our way of evaluating if we're actually measuring the thing that we think we're measuring. And one participant in our study gave some great ideas for how to do this with respect to fairness metrics for recommendations specifically, that is really easy, simple, and actionable, and can help us expose potential limitations of our metric choices. And the final example I'll share today is to conduct what's called citizen panels and assemblies. So these are, it's an idea from political theory where you get a representative sample of a population in a room, you educate them about an issue, and you have them vote on a choice related to that issue. And one participant brought up an idea that maybe we could have people, users, representative samples from a user base, vote on issues like which fairness metrics are best to use in the event that we have to choose one or two that are conflicting with one another, so that practitioners don't have to make those value judgments for others. So to briefly conclude, I did want to mention that in our paper, we discuss at length the importance of striking a balance between working within the system and working to fundamentally change that system. And I believe that there is space within the machine learning fairness research community for both idealistic and pragmatic visions of machine learning fairness. But for a broader discussion on this topic, I do recommend that you check out our paper. So thank you so much, and I look forward to answering questions.